Like most journalists, veteran reporter Tonya Mosley has spent her career telling other people's stories. But then she got a call from a man named Antonio Wiley. In her podcast, She Is a Name, Tonya and Antonio investigate the disappearance of his mother, Anita Wiley, who went missing in Detroit in 1987. And the more they learn about what happened to Anita, the more Tonya realizes that the investigation will impact her entire life. I'm Kathleen Goldhar, and this is Crime Story. Tonya and Antonio, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
So, Tonya, I'm going to start this off a little differently. I'm usually the one that introduces people, but I want you to introduce Antonio to our audience.
Well, first off, Antonio is my nephew, and he also is my nephew by virtue of my sister, Anita, who was a sister that I never met, but have gotten to know over the last 20 or so years, and especially over the last year through the making of this podcast.
And Antonio, then why did you call Tonya?
Yeah, Tonya, so we have a relationship through my grandfather, O.C. Hill, who's, he's passed away since, but initially conversing with him about our family and just our history. He had a very positive outlook on Tonya and suggested that we should get together, we should talk.
So let's back it up to there. Tonya, am I correct in understanding that when Antonio first called you, you didn't know who he was?
Right. It was the summer of 2004. And I was a young woman in my 20s, starting my life. I had grown up with my mother and my mother's side of the family, and I didn't know my father. I had met my father maybe a year or two before I received a call from Antonio, and we were forging a relationship. And I knew that by virtue of developing this relationship with my father that I would meet other parts of my family, but I had no idea that I had a big sister until Antonio called me one day out of the blue. And I will say that while it was a surprise to me, it wasn't a shock, if that makes sense, because I knew that there were parts of me that I didn't know about myself. And it also made sense to me that I had a big sister because it was always something that I had yearned for.
We'll get to Anita and why Antonio was calling you specifically because you're also a journalist. But there was something that you said in the podcast that really moved me, that you used to tell people you had an older sister because you wanted an older sister, which I guess is like, fine. A lot of kids who don't have siblings will make that up. But your fictitious, in quotes, older sister, you named her Anita.
When I was young, I was around second or third grade, I made up this story that I had a big sister. And it wasn't just that I named her Anita. She was also really vivid in my mind. She was all the things that I had imagined for myself when I became a young woman. And what is pretty amazing about it, and I still marvel about it sometimes in quiet moments, is that I thought of her as an adult. I hadn't thought of her as another child, as a big sister. And I named her Anita, and I would tell classmates that I had an older sister named Anita. And when I learned that it was true, there's almost a part of me that couldn't face that for many years, that actually it was something that was true.
It gave me shivers when I heard it. I couldn't believe that you had named her that.
And on some level, I believe that I knew and she knew that we were connected and we were related, and that connection would come back in a very profound way when Antonio reached out to me, because that connection needed to be there for us to take this journey that we then went on together in telling Anita's story.
Tonya, what did you understand when you first heard from Antonio? What did he tell you about Anita and why he was calling you?
Well, first off, he didn't tell me the full story about his mother. He told me that his mother was missing. And for a long time, that was all that I knew. And we were learning about each other in other ways. Like I was learning who he grew up with, what his life was like in the moment. He was in school and college at the time. It was only several months later, after we really got to know each other, that he told me the details of how his mother never returned home one day and how he spent several weeks alone as a young boy before he finally reached out to find help. And I knew from that point that there was something nefarious that had happened. But I'll tell you, over the time period that we got to know each other, it was really about mending broken family connections. And there was very little that we would talk about regarding Anita until Antonio notified me that he had given his DNA to Detroit police as part of this larger program where they were able to connect the DNA of anonymous people that were buried in a cemetery and loved ones. They're trying to solve cases, missing persons cases, that then we started to have a real conversation about his mother and her life. And that was just a few years ago. So really, we went almost 20 years just having a familial relationship and deepening our connections in that way.
So, Antonio, can you tell me about the family that you knew and the sort of situation that broke up some of those familiar ties that Tonya's talking about? Can you tell me about your mother and her family and sort of where the split happened and what kind of life that they were living that allowed this to happen?
Yeah, my mother was very complex in that way. I think similar to Tonya, she had a relationship with my grandfather, but it was kind of a distant one. But my grandmother had remarried. She had been adopted into that family, and that was our family. That's the family I grew up with. That's the family I knew. Unfortunately, I lost my grandmother at a young age, but her family also. So, she come from a really complex family, as it were, during that time. But she herself was very young, very outgoing, and she decided to forge a life of her own. When she went missing, for me at least, it became kind of a journey to try to piece those puzzles together about who she was, about her relationship to these different facets of her life. And that's what led me to my grandfather and then eventually to Tonya.
One of the things that became clear to all of us during the making of the actual podcast was that Antonio was so young when his mother disappeared that there were parts of her life that he didn't even know. Or he could not really contextualize or understand because he was a youth at the time that she disappeared.
How old was he?
14 years old.
You were 14, Antonio. That's so young.
Yeah. 14 years old. And Antonio's mother had him when she was 14 years old. And then her mother died when she was 17 years old. And so she was basically on her own at a very young age. And like me, she didn't know our father. So she was able to connect with him. And from what we were able to put together, forged a relationship with him. But she was a woman out there on her own as a young lady trying to make it in Detroit in the 80s.
Can we talk about Detroit in the 80s? Because Detroit in the 80s is a character in this story as much as the two of you are.
1980s Detroit, we were just entering what we would now know as the crack epidemic and the divestment of the automotive industry in the city and manufacturing overall, leaving the country and going overseas into other places. And what that created was this mixture of lawlessness within the city of Detroit.
Detroit once was called the City Beautiful. It is now called the murder capital of the United States. Of the 10 biggest cities, Detroit has the highest per capita homicide rate.
And Anita and so many others were trying to find their way in a city that was losing its grasp. Drugs was a way for people to find a quick and easy way to not only make money, but also escape from what was just an economic downfall.
Antonio, how did Anita get caught up in that? What did you find out about her life and selling of drugs and using drugs? And like, how did that catch up with her?
I think Tonya just kind of hit the nail on the head in a way. I think that, she was very young at the time, and maybe she saw an outlet, as well as an opportunity to provide for myself, obviously a child, but then also her younger siblings and her family. She had grown up, my grandparents were kind of merchants at the time. They owned various little party stores and things like that. So she'd come up kind of business astute, I guess you can say. So she kind of had a quick wit about herself and ability to adapt and find opportunity. And I think, as Tonya pointed out, with the emergence of, the wealth creation that drugs kind of pouring into the city provided, I think she just kind of found opportunity in those circles and was able to provide a life for herself.
And that's part of the youthfulness, when you think about it. When I was growing up, I used to think of drug dealing and drug dealers just based on what I would see in the movies that, like Miami Vice, Kingpin, and like they're living large and all of these things. And for Anita and so many people, drugs was actually a way to just survive, to be able to pay rent from day to day, to be able to bring food into the house and to make sure that kids had clothing. For her at that time, it seemed like a viable option. And I think one of the things that I've sat with in thinking about Anita's story is just if her life hadn't been cut short, how she would have figured out that there were other options and other ways to be able to survive too.
As we're talking about that, I'm thinking, wow, if this woman who was capable of that at 14 and 15 had grown up, what could she have done?
Exactly. Yep.
Tonya, you mentioned this earlier, but I want to hear about it a little bit more in depth. Can you tell me about the days and the weeks after she went missing and sort of what Antonio had to face?
When Antonio was a young teenager, around 14, 15 years old, he asked to spend the weekend with a cousin. It was the summer of 1987. And when he returned home to his apartment that he shared with his mother wasn't home. And initially, he thought maybe she was at the store or at work, but she didn't come home that night and she didn't come home the next day. And days turned into weeks. There was a moment where Antonio finally realized, after reaching out to relatives to try to find out where she was and no one knew where she was, that he called his father and said, I think something is really wrong. And that's when police were involved, and she never came home after that.
How long did it take before she, like you've mentioned this, but how long did it take before the family was able to find out where she was?
Well, in 2016, Antonio gave his DNA to Detroit police as part of this program called Operation United. And it took 4 years from there for them to finally find a match. Authorities dug up the bodies of these anonymous folks that had been buried at this cemetery outside of the city. And Anita was the first match as part of this program. I'll never forget the day. We were just a few weeks before the pandemic in 2020. I received a phone call from Antonio, and he told me we found her. There's a match. She had been in this cemetery all of this time. Actually, she went missing in the summer of 1987. And a few months later, authorities found her body in a home that was an abandoned home that had been set on fire. Her remains were so badly charred, there were no dental records, and they were not able to identify her, and so they buried her.
In this place for unmarked, unknown victims.
Yes. Yep.
Antonio, during the years that she was missing, tell me about what efforts your family took over those years to look for her, to make people try to be more concerned about where she was.
Yeah, there was an effort on behalf of some of my aunts.
Her sisters.
Yeah, and as well as my grandmother's sisters, which would have been her aunts, my great aunts, who were the elders at that time to file police missing persons reports and get the police involved, sounding the alarm, so to speak. My grandfather, etc., all, you know, met with police and, filed missing persons reports, just tried to bring some awareness to her, to her situation and find her. And when we finally did get her back, I was able to host a memorial service on her behalf. And people came out, some of those same aunts and uncles, and spoke to that, their frustration with how the investigation was handled and just kind of some of the challenges that they had trying to get the police to take it serious.
Do you know why they had those kind of challenges? You talk about it a bit in the podcast, which I think is really interesting and also part of the history of Detroit.
Yeah, the city was going through a transition. I think you got to remember during that time, everything was pen and paper. By the time I picked up my research, everything was being digitized. So I myself went and looked through archives and fingered through files and things like that. And, it was a mess. Once it was filed away, it just kind of faded into obscurity. So what would happen was that they would follow up year after year, and each time they would have to start over because there was no file, there was no case number that they could correlate. So it became kind of a tattered effort on behalf of aunts that were coming from out of state to do it and family that was here in Detroit that was also trying to get the police involved. So
family members felt dismissed by it.
Yeah.
They felt that when they initially went to police said, well, she's an adult. Maybe she left on her own. And initially, according to one of Anita's sisters, they wouldn't even take the missing persons report. They wouldn't file the first time. Today, all of the investigators from that time are no longer here. So authorities just tell us they apologize and they're working on behalf of trying to figure it out today. But if we look back at that time period, we know that it sounds right because back then, really, you could not file a missing persons report on an adult within the first 28 to 48 hours, and sometimes even longer because that person might have left on their own. And Detroit was dealing with a homicide rate that they have not dealt with since then. Nearly 700 people were murdered that year in the city alone. It was just lawlessness on a scale that was both taxing for the city of Detroit and its police force that was also dealing with its own internal struggles too.
Yeah, and did race play into it and gender?
Oh, I'm pretty sure race and gender played a huge role into it. And also, Anita had a criminal record. She had been arrested before for drug possession. And so when you look at it on paper, oh, well, maybe perhaps this person is just out doing the thing that they do. For Antonio, I know a long time there was a little bit of anger because as a child, you weren't sure family members were doing enough on behalf of your mom. I think as an adult, we can see it from adult eyes and understand the complexities of it. Am I right in saying that, Antonio?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Indeed.
How did you process it all as a 14, 15-year-old?
Oh, wow. It was a rough time. It really was. I slept with it. I ate with it. Every day of my life, it just consumed me. And yeah, I mean, to your point, I was kind of a bit bitter, I guess you could say, at certain family members, and not just understanding it from a child's perspective. I thought that the city should be on fire or something. I don't, like everyone,
Of course, it's your mother.
Yeah. But there was a method to the madness, I guess you could say, that, they understood the patience and the processes to handle such situations. But, I just began to overturn stones and just kind of look in places that was familiar to me to try to understand and retrace her steps to see maybe had something been overlooked on our behalf.
Can you tell me then, Antonio, about the process for you now that you'd found your mom and you had a memorial, you were able to at least put an end to that part of your search. And then it shifted to a murder investigation, which the two of you took on. Can we move to that part of it? What did you guys figure out? What were some of the things that you found out about what could have happened to her?
Well, we're still kind of piecing it all together, but what we've so far been able to stitch together is some of the people that she was involved with during that time and some of their backgrounds. I was kind of shocked to find that once we identified her and I met with the investigators, they already had a bit of a file that they presented, just kind of showing some of the backstory. What that looks like, it's still yet to come, but we did kind of tease out through a series of interviews and things like that a lot of people shared the same sentiment and had their suspicions about what could have happened and the individuals that could have been involved. So right now, it's still kind of an ongoing investigation.
You know, like so many times, and we've just talked about the police inadequacies of trying to find your mother, but then it was another police officer who was leading up this Project United, who had this like motivation to connect these people to their families. And so it's always this redeeming humanity that I love so much about this podcast, but also just about life. And I was really taken by that one police officer who just seemed to be so motivated to connect families that she had no connection with herself, but understood the need to do this.
Detective Sergeant Shannon Jones is a phenomenal police officer with Detroit Police. And one of the things that I found as a journalist over time is that it always is. It's these individuals within departments that have a passion for what they do, and they're the ones to help solve cases. And Sergeant Jones was just dedicated to being able to identify all of those bodies at that grave site and also try to bring closure through closing these investigations and solving them.
We've done over 200 in the past 5 years. 200, and we've been able to unite right around 20 families through DNA, and then like another 10 just by revetting all the case files before we even had to dig them. We were able to identify them. So I want to thank everyone.
Anita was found in November of 1987. She disappeared around July. Her body was found in this burned out home. So if you think about this, she disappeared in July. She was alive, more than likely from July all the way until her body was found. And authorities, we found through a coroner's report that we were able to get through the Freedom of Information Act that laid out the details of her murder, which are pretty gruesome. But she was found in this home. She had been stabbed to death and her body set on fire. And then the home set on fire. And authorities initially thought that she was a teenage girl because of the size of her body. So that right there was a challenge, because when the family went to file a missing persons report, Anita at the time was almost 29 years old. So they were thinking that they had a body of a young teen, and because she was a very small woman. This home was in a place called Highland Park, which is a city within the city right in the middle of Detroit. And there had been lots of bodies found in that particular area. Arson was a very popular way during that time period of getting rid of bodies. And so they had been dealing with lots of fires around that time, where they would then put the fires out and find a body. So this was kind of common at that time period. What was pretty unusual, though, is that even though they found that body and they reported it out to the news media, there wasn't a lot of media around it. And maybe that was because there were so many that they were dealing with at a particular time period. A year later, there was an update on the story, and they said that this body was not a child, but yet it was an older person, and if anyone had any information to notify police. And then that's the last that we we could find on outreach to the public to try to figure out the identity of this body. Witnesses who lived on the street where the fire happened say that they saw two men leaving this house. They were able to give authorities details on what these men were wearing. And authorities have held on to that information for all of these years. What we have been able to piece together through family and friends is that Anita was in a relationship with someone who now is serving a life sentence for another set of murders. And while authorities say that this is a person of interest, they have not gone so far to say that this person is the main suspect. What's interesting is that this person is also someone that the family has suspected all of these years because Anita was in an abusive relationship with this person.
But as we mentioned, it's not a closed case, so that person hasn't been charged. No one's been charged for her murder.
No one has been charged. Authorities have asked for an interview with this person, and this person has not granted them that interview. We have also asked a couple of times, and we're waiting to hear back. This person also has a brother who's also serving a life sentence. The two of them worked in conjunction with each other on this other murder that they were convicted of. And he has been more open with us and wanting to talk with us. And so we're in dialogue with him at this time.
Antonio, how has working on this podcast changed, I don't want to say your grief, because I suspect that's just a moving target, but has it changed the way you see this story and your life? Like, how has this shifted you?
Yeah, I feel very optimistic that we will get justice for Anita, for my mother, and that, all the research and things like that I've done, and, the interviews and things like that we're on the right track. So
yeah.
I'm very optimistic. I think for the most part, it was just receiving her remains and giving her an honorable burial, I think helped not just myself, but my family bring some level of closure after all these years. But at the same token, there's still a lot of work still to be done, not just for my mother, but, to spread awareness for other people like her.
And Tonya, I worked on a podcast with my best friend on a story that she dealt with, and that was a friend. And I felt a lot of pressure. And it was very hard because you engage in the story in a fully different way than you do as a journalist, even a caring journalist. How did this shift you?
What a question, Kathleen. I think that I'll say, first of all, throughout my career, I've been part of news discussions where we're talking about the merit of a story. Why should we care? Why is a story important? Even when it comes to murder investigations. And one thing about Anita's story that was important to me, not only because she's my sister, but because I have encountered so many people who have wanted me to tell their stories, and for various different reasons, not because I didn't want to, but because I couldn't, because we didn't have the time or the space, or maybe the details of the story didn't rise to reporting on it. And there are all these metrics that you use to make that decision. It was really important for me to tell Anita's story because she is such a regular person. By all accounts, she lived a pretty unremarkable life. Her life was so short. She didn't get to fulfill the things that I know that she would have been able to do had she lived. And I wanted to be able to tell this type of story, not only because she's connected to me, but she represents humanity. She represents us. She represents the everyday people. And it was really important for me to get it right because, there's one thing, like when you're not used to your story being told, believe it or not, like there's a higher standard to it because you just haven't seen it out there in the world. And so I wanted to make sure that Anita's sister felt that the story was true to her and the rest of the family as well. And what has come out of it is just this overwhelming amount of gratitude. And that is really moving to me because I think that stories, I know it sounds really sentimental, but stories can be healing. And for Anita's family, think about it. Over 30 years, they've not been able to speak about it. Not even to themselves, really, or each other. And so to be able to say her name, to speak these details, to say that her story is just as important as all the other stories we hear out there, and possibly get close to some closure in some way, it's tremendous. And it also allows us to take those steps towards healing.
You never knew your sister, but do you feel like you do now after this?
I feel a deep connection to her, and I feel a deep responsibility to her. I think my responsibility extends in my life, in the way that I live my life, in the way that I think about life and living life to the fullest, and making certain that Antonio and I are connected and that we continue to build and grow. And we also continue that for the sake of our own children. That is the way that I feel deeply connected to her.
Well, it was very moving and really powerful. I can't imagine how powerful it must have been for your family. So I really appreciate the time you guys are giving me, and I really appreciate the work you guys did.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to Crime Story from CBC Podcasts. There are a lot more episodes of Crime Story available right now. Just search for Crime Story on the CBC Listen app or wherever you get your podcasts. Access them ad-free and a week early by subscribing to the CBC True Crime channel on Apple Podcasts, and follow CBC Podcasts on YouTube for exclusive behind-the-scenes video content. Crime Story is hosted by me, Kathleen Goldhar. This episode is produced by Sarah Clayton and Nikki Manfredi. Sound design by Mitchell Stewart and Julian Uzielli. Our senior producer is Kate Evans, our video producer is Evan Agard, and our YouTube producer is John Lee. Audio sourced from Local 4 News, Click on Detroit, and She Is a Name, a podcast from TMI Productions and APM Studios. Executive producers are Cecil Fernandez and Chris Oak. Tanya Springer is the senior manager of CBC Podcasts, and Arif Noorani is the director of CBC Podcasts.